The Angel of Harlem. Chapter 1. Know Your Onions.
What's she like?
A chill ran down the spine of the Harlem gangster. The question was innocent enough, but Bumpy knew it had a very dangerous answer. A wave of anger crashed over Bumpy. He was about to pull the car over and slap his cousin upside his head, but Esteban followed up.
Madam St. Clair? Is she nice?
Bumpy exhaled. His temper cooled, and he suddenly felt guilty for overreacting. Madam St. Clair was tough, a stone-cold Creole gangster from New Orleans. But contrary to what Esteban and all of Harlem believed, Sabine St. Clair was not the queen of Harlem. Like a speakeasy in the basement of a laundromat, Sabine St. Clair was the front for his boss, his real boss. She liked people who know their onions. You heard me? Bumpy looked over at Esteban. His naive young cousin was light-skinned due to the fact that his mother was Puerto Rican. His eyes always seemed wide with excitement. Esteban seemed far too happy, given the dangerous line of work he had chosen. He a damn fool, a dewdropper, wannabe cake eater, Bumpy thought to himself. But he knew his annoyance was a smokescreen to cover the pangs of guilt that were rumbling inside of him. He had brought his cousin into a dangerous situation. If Esteban were to discover the identity of Bumpy's real boss, the consequences would be severe. He had debated in his head 100 times how he might intercede on his cousin's behalf should Esteban stumble onto the truth. Bumpy pressed the brakes, and his red-colored Ford Model A stopped at the traffic light above 123rd Street. Bumpy noticed the colored folk crossing at the light, and he couldn't help but think of Willie, who had looked so confused before he died. Bumpy had seen more men die than he could count, but the look of horror and confusion right before the boss put a bullet between Willie's eyes haunted him. He had told himself that he had tried to warn Willie not to go snooping through the boss's house. But Willie's curiosity had gotten him killed. The boss had one rule above all others. No one can know who she really is. Hell, Bumpy didn't even know who she was for real. Not for certain anyway. He didn't even know she had a name. Demons don't got no names, he had concluded, but he knew he couldn't let the same thing happen to Esteban. His boss was harsh, but she lived by her own code. She had one rule. Willie broke it. So now he doing the big sleep. Despite her ferocity, in her own way, Bumpy found her to be beautiful. She retained a gracefulness that even the white women of Manhattan didn't possess. She a Sheba, sure as you born. His boss had curves unlike any human woman. She had perky, voluptuous breasts, thick hips with a tiny waist. And her face, it was both savage and seductive. And her scent, it was like molasses, sweat, and copper all mixed together. It was strange, yet intoxicating. Bumpy always felt his loins stir whenever he got too close.
Lights changed.
Bumpy's mind returned to the Model A. He changed the gear of the car and accelerated. He looked over at his cousin. Esteban's interest in Bumpy's new line of work was not entirely his cousin's fault. The demon paid him well, very well. With his earnings, Bumpy easily could afford a new Ford Model A in bright red, and after Esteban saw that new car, he was hooked. The kid had pestered him nearly to death, and finally, Esteban had practically blackmailed his cousin by giving him an ultimatum. If Bumpy didn't let Esteban come work for him, he'd go down and see if he could work for the preacher. And the preacher was the most deadly gangster in Harlem. Niggas don't last long working for the preacher. At least Bumpy could keep an eye on his cousin, and the work his boss required was nowhere near as dangerous. Esteban would be fine as long as he stayed in his place and kept his mouth shut. The two men drove through Columbia University, and as if by magic, The people lining the bustling streets changed from a kaleidoscope of red, high yellow, caramel, and dark brown to a drab, monochromatic pale color resembling eggshells.
So who's this old white man we picking up?
Esteban, I done told you. Don't ask no questions.
I ain't no stool pigeon.
Boy, is you hard of hearing? Bumpy vowed to slap his cousin at the next light, but Esteban yelled out,
"Coppers!"
and he pointed to a police car that was parked on a nearby corner about a block ahead. Bumpy's first instinct was to slam the brakes, but he looked down at the speedometer and made sure he wasn't going over the speed limit. He tapped the brakes slightly. Put your hand down, fool. Everything's Jake.
You got a gat, right?
If I do, I'ma hit you with it. Just stay cool, son. Most of the time, coppers don't want no trouble. But Bumpy could feel a lump forming in his throat. He tried to swallow it, but found his throat was parched. He looked over at the police car, which was coming closer into view. He could make out the silhouette of two people inside. You remember the story? Esteban nodded. If they ask, just let me do the talking.
Why I gotta be the butler?
Boy, if you don't shut the... But Bumpy could clearly make out the red hair of the driver of the police car. They were almost upon them. Instinctively, he patted his breast pocket and found that his pistol was still strapped to his chest, but he forced himself to smile. Don't look at him. Just look straight ahead and smile. Esteban did as he was told. It was humiliating, but it was nothing he hadn't done 100 times before. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, fearful that his hands might be shaking. He had no desire to go back to prison or die in a shootout. And as they approached the police car, Bumpy began running through his list of reasons as to why they had been driving a nice car in the white area of town. As Bumpy's Model A inched past the white police car, his eyes immediately focused on the rearview mirror. He held his breath, anticipating the flashing red lights. Esteban immediately turned around and looked out the back. Boy, look straight. Bumpy had to force himself to do the same. His eyes were so fixated on the rearview mirror, he feared he might drift into oncoming traffic. Bumpy drove away wistfully with bated breath. But as the police vehicle faded from view, Bumpy allowed himself to exhale. The remaining 15 blocks through the Upper East Side passed without incident, and when they pulled up to the building on 79th Street, Howard Mayman was waiting. Mayman must have been about 60 years old. He was wearing a three-piece suit that was just a few shades darker than the hair on his head, at least what he had left. He was carrying a brown leather briefcase. Bumpy looked at Esteban, who hopped out of the car and allowed the white man to climb into the back seat. Bumpy knew that no one would think twice about a colored man driving a nice car if a white man was in the back. Esteban opened his mouth, about to ask Mayman a question, but Bumpy merely raised his eyebrow to his cousin, and Esteban's mouth dutifully closed. The three men sat in silence as the car engine rattled and rumbled on the way back to Harlem. And once the car passed 96th Street, Bumpy heard Mayman's briefcase click open. Bumpy looked into the rearview mirror and saw the old man pull out a black sackcloth and place it over his head. Bumpy looked over at his cousin, whose eyes went wide again. Bumpy shook his head no, and Esteban looked confused and then disappointed. But the important thing was that he kept his mouth shut. The boy had passed Bumpy's first test. The car parked on West 151st Street. Bumpy and Esteban got out the car. Bumpy reached into the back seat and helped Mayman get out. Despite having the black sackcloth over his head, Mayman remained calm and allowed the two men to lead him to the large 4-story house. Wait here, Bumpy told his cousin. Esteban's constant look of disappointment was grating on Bumpy's nerves, but Bumpy couldn't take any chances. He looked up towards the roof, expecting to hear a sound, but all was calm. Bumpy escorted Mayman up the stairs to the second floor. Bumpy opened the door to the drawing room and sat Mayman down at the table. And like clockwork, Mayman put his briefcase on the table, opened it, and pulled out a folder, while still wearing the sack over his head. Mayman waited patiently in silence. Bumpy wondered how much the boss was paying him. He reckoned it must be a lot of cheddar for him to tolerate her peculiar needs. But while the white man on the second floor sat patiently in silence, Bumpy knew there was another white man upstairs, and he wouldn't be so ducky. Bumpy ventured up to the top floor and approached the large white metallic door with a circular hatch. It looked more like a door to a vault than a door to a bedroom. It had a rectangular opening at eye level with miniature bars through the opening. Bumpy peered in and saw the other old white man. "How you doing, Mr. King? You all right?" Bumpy said while looking around. The alleged king looked startled, then annoyed. Bumpy instantly suspected that something was up, but he surveyed the room and nothing seemed out of place. Bumpy looked and saw the king's ankle was still locked and shackled to a chain that was bolted to the floor.
"Awa and bare your hide."
Bumpy didn't know what that meant, but he knew it wasn't nice. "Now see them, Mr. King? That do confuse me a little bit. I thought they spoke English over there in England."
"Aye, but I'm not English. I'm Scottish."
"Ain't that the same thing?" The old man rolled his eyes and cursed at Bumpy again in the unknown tongue. "Madame St. Clair done taught me some French. Parlez-vous français? Is that what you be speaking?" But as Bumpy spoke, he continued to look around the room, trying to see if anything was out of place. Bumpy zeroed in on the radio he had given the old man. It was unplugged and laying on the bed. "You know that radio work better if you plug it in."
"I didn't understand these new gadgets. Why don't you come in here and show me, laddie?"
Bumpy knew this old white man was obviously delusional, but extremely dangerous. 2 weeks ago, his boss had ordered Bumpy and his men to go capture the supposed king. Bumpy had reckoned it would be a piece of cake, but the old king dodged punches with an ease that Bumpy had never seen before. He could move, jump, and attack in a way that didn't seem human, as if defying the laws of nature. The old king had put 3 of his boys in the hospital before they finally knocked him unconscious, and Bumpy wasn't about to walk into this man's cell alone. The old man looked at Bumpy, but then he looked away and picked up a magazine. "What's the matter, Mr. King? They don't like no jazz over there in England?"
You people and your infernal cacophonies."
"You people? What people be that?"
"Bloody Americans. You can't appreciate anything classic."
Bumpy wasn't sure if the old man meant what he said. He had never been called an American before. "You have a good evening, Mr. King." Bumpy took one more look around the room. Nothing seemed amiss, other than the unplugged radio. Bumpy concluded that European white folks must not have radios yet, so he turned and went downstairs and walked outside where Esteban was waiting, looking as if a million questions were about to jump out of his mouth. "But me." Esteban pulled out a lighter and lit Bumpy's cigarette, who took a drag and savored the taste. "Did you hear about Homicide Hank beating that white boy?" But Esteban wouldn't let Bumpy change the subject.
This setup. Something ain't Jake.
"It pay good. Ain't that what you wanted?"
Why the matter, St. Clair?
"I didn't hire you to be no gumshoe. I hired you to be a lookout. So do that."
What was that?
"Don't pay that no mind."
But the roof?
Bumpy pulled out his gun that was strapped to his chest, and he aimed it directly at his cousin's forehead. "Nigga, you better know your onions." Bumpy could tell his cousin was more confused than frightened. Bumpy cocked the gun. This is how the boss deals with dewdroppers.
Sorry, man, sorry.
You gonna look out?
Yeah.
Good. Don't move till I come back with Mayman. No matter what, you heard me? Esteban nodded, and Bumpy went into the building. He peered up the steps but couldn't see anything. But not a minute later, he heard his boss descending. When the boss talked business with Mayman, Bumpy knew she didn't like eavesdroppers. So he stood in the hall next to the front door, but through the window pane in the door, Bumpy could see his cousin peering in from outside. I'm gonna have to kill this boy my damn self if he keep at it, Bumpy thought to himself. Again, he pulled out his gun and pointed it at his cousin, whose face instantly disappeared. Bumpy waited a few more minutes, and he heard the door to the upstairs living room open, and his boss said,
"Just get it done."
Bumpy heard his boss walk upstairs. The boss gonna visit the king, huh? Bumpy wasn't sure why she always needed to speak to that crazy old man. But if her business with Mayman was done, he needed to go retrieve the bean counter. Bumpy walked upstairs and entered the living room. Mayman was putting his papers back into his briefcase with the sack over his head. You ready to go home, Mr. Mayman? The old man said yes, and Bumpy grabbed Mayman's arm and helped him to stand. And as the two men were leaving the living room and approaching the stairs, Bumpy heard something. Wait here, Bumpy told Mayman, and he pulled his gun out and raced upstairs. When Bumpy got to the top floor, he saw that the white metallic door was wide open. The old man was on top of the boss, his knees pinning down her arms and wings. He had a deranged look of hatred in his eyes, and his hands were wrapped around her neck like a viper, squeezing the life out.
This ends tonight, Demona.
Bumpy could see his boss's tail flailing about in a vain attempt to knock the old man off. It was no use. Bumpy pulled out his gun. The bullet from the pistol ripped into the old man's chest, but he didn't fall. He didn't even look up at Bumpy. He just kept the demon's neck in a death grip. And even though his white shirt began to fill with deep crimson, the rage in his eyes was unabated. For a split second, Bumpy was bewildered as to how any man could take a bullet like that. But he forced himself to snap out of it. He aimed the gun again and fired. This has been Chapter 1 of The Angel of Harlem by Andrew L. Productions. It was performed by Jeremy Durham with the voice talents of Andre Martinez and Daisy Mae Parsons. If you've enjoyed this broadcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a like. And if you're in a position to support this and other projects, please visit our Patreon page, Andrew Creates. It really helps us out a lot. Thank you.